Welcome to Kiffin's Keep, an intellectual resource for the pillar and buttress of the truth, which is the church. This is a project of the London Lyceum, which is all about serious thinking for a serious church. I'm Jordan Stefaniak, host of Kiffin's Keep and president of the London Lyceum. And as always, I'm excited to be here with you all today. In today's episode, I'm going to be covering the topic of the sufficiency of Scripture and biblical counseling. Before I jump into the episode, do remember to like the video if you enjoyed the content. Even if you didn't like it, if it made you think, you can still hit like. That's okay. And subscribe to the channel so you don't miss anything, whether it's from my show, from Generally Particular, or from our general London Lyceum content. We want to make sure that you remember and see it every time we post something new so you can enjoy it and benefit from it. And do leave a comment if you agree, disagree, or have other thoughts. I imagine you will have ideas and thoughts on this episode. So, like I said, talking sufficiency and biblical counseling, I think I've done one or two of these in the past, and I decided to do another one because of a couple of things. One, sufficiency of Scripture is definitely, it's something I've done a lot of thinking on, and I've done a lot of writing on in the past. Biblical counseling, for whatever reason, seems to hit on a couple of notes of things that I've critiqued and pushed back on in the past. And so I just thought, hey, this is a good time to do it. And then also I've read a couple of more articles that one of them old from last year, I think, and then seen just stuff online that I'm like, is this really what we're thinking on this topic? So let's go ahead and jump into it. And as a reminder, this is a very special YouTube studio. As you can see, I've got hay bales from my children on my bookshelf, and I've got toys and stuff in here. This is about the highest tech YouTube studio that you can find. You can go watch other people and see all their pristine backgrounds. Anyway, this should be fun. So I want to engage in particular an essay by Heath Lambert, fbcjacks.com, and it's got six crucial confusions on the new integrationists. I'm going to drop a link to that in the description. You can go check it out if you want. He lists 6 confusions, and ironically, or not ironically, maybe unsurprisingly, I think he's the one that's actually confused about a couple of these things. I'm not going to cover everything. I want to cover three topics, 3 areas. 1, what does scriptural sufficiency actually mean? 2, what does integration mean? 3, what does moral formation and sanctification require? And I should preface, I'm not a biblical counselor. I'm not a counselor. I do not have a counseling degree. I don't have a psychology degree. I don't have anything like that. My parents are both counselors. I've grown up in that sort of context a good bit, so I've got a fair amount of secondhand knowledge. But when it comes to sufficiency, I feel like I've got a decent handle on that, given that I've published a good amount on that. It's been pretty central to some of my early work. So let's go ahead and start with, what does scriptural sufficiency mean? And I'll point you to a Gospel Coalition article that I wrote on that very question, what does scriptural sufficiency mean? In the description, again, you can go check it out. I think it's like 1,000 words. I think it lays out pretty clearly, what does it mean, what does it not mean? Because there's a lot of confusions about this, like I said, ironically. And I want to engage a little bit of the sufficiency statement. So there's this thing called the sufficiencystatement.com, and I think I can do a presentation. No, that's not it. I need to, not now. How do I do this? This is, live and on air. Well, not live, but, I'm doing my best here. So I'm going to share a window. Boom. So you guys can see this right here. Yep, you see that. So sufficiency statement. You go to this thing. It's just got 4 points. It's very, very clear, very simple. The key point here that I want to engage is on the sufficiency of Scripture. So some interesting things that are stated in here. As one of the 4 perfections of Scripture, the doctrine of biblical sufficiency teaches that Christians require no additional revelation to understand how to please God in any area of life. It's a bedrock theological foundation of the biblical counseling movement. So it's interesting, in any area of life. Well, like, what does it mean to please God as a car mechanic? What does it mean to please God as a gardener? What does it mean to please God as a construction worker? There's all sorts of principles you obviously glean from Scripture about how to behave as a moral and virtuous person, how to please God in those ways. But certainly, I would think that pleasing God includes excellence, craftsmanship, and mechanical ability and ingenuity in those things. And I don't think Scripture gives explicit guidelines on how to go about doing that. So I think that seems to be, I get the point, but it's too expansive, and it's not wrong it's not denying sufficiency to do that, and I'm going to show you that from the Second London Confession of Faith in a moment. But also, they go on in this, basically this, if you apply to counseling, it means that Christians require no special knowledge or methodology drawn from outside Scripture to construct a system of counseling care. So I think it's important to note that they're talking about systems. And this, what gets confusing, I think, to me, is that they assume that if you're using anything outside Scripture, you're then constructing an alternative and competing system. But that's just not how systems work. Systems can take pieces here and there and sort of, in an ad hoc way, bolt them on. And I guess that what's being assumed here is that it's a whole package, and you can't bolt on anything. It's the whole thing or it's nothing. I don't think that's realistic in real life. Scripture explicitly claims to address our entire spiritual life, including the challenges faced in a fallen world, which are the same challenges we face in counseling conversations. So yes and no. It does address the most important characteristics of the spiritual life, but there's other characteristics that it gives generic principles to, and that you have to do logical reasoning to get to the proper solution for it. And we can go on with this, but I want to point out. And I guess one more thing: any approach to counseling that attempts to supplement Scripture with secular resources is an error and will harm those it means to help. I mean, so it's and will harm those it means to help. So certainly that's not the case. I mean, what if a secular resource corresponds exactly what the scriptural witness says? Maybe somebody didn't know a text taught that, and they go find something about habituation in a secular source, and it actually is the exact thing that Proverbs or something else says. Does that mean it's going to harm them because they took a secular resource? No, of course not. That's silly. So let's go ahead and look at the Second London Confession of Faith. What does sufficiency mean here? So the Holy Scripture is the only sufficient, certain, infallible rule of saving knowledge, faith, and obedience. Although the light of nature and the works of creation and providence do so far manifest the goodness and power of God to leave man inexcusable, yet they are not sufficient to give that knowledge of God and his will, which is necessary unto salvation. So I think the key point here is, what is sufficiency talking about? It's talking about salvific aspects of the Christian life. Saving knowledge, saving faith, saving obedience. Scripture is sufficient for that. And yet the light of nature is also playing a role. So let's look at chapter 1, paragraph 6. Scroll on down and tell me, guys, if you're a regular watcher of this, is this me sharing the screen here, letting you watch it instead of me just quoting it? Is that useful? Drop a comment, tell me. Okay, paragraph 6, the whole counsel of God concerning all things necessary for his own glory, man's salvation, faith, and life is either expressly set down or necessarily contained in the Holy Scripture. Now, this necessarily contained in the Holy Scripture, I think that is an intensification of the Westminster Confession of Faith, which says, by good and necessary consequence, everything's contained. I think it means the same thing as that. And I'm not going to argue for that right now. Nevertheless, there are some circumstances concerning the worship of God and government of the church, common human actions and societies, which are to be ordered by the light of nature and Christian prudence, according to the general rules of the word. So this is very, very important. It says that there are some circumstances concerning the worship of God. You would think that biblical, counseling would certainly fit underneath this, the government of the church. These things are common human actions and societies, which are to be ordered by the light of nature and Christian prudence. The light of nature and Christian prudence. This is a key thing that the biblical counseling movement of those like Keith Lambert would do well to dwell upon. The light of nature and Christian prudence. A lot of the discussion that I've seen has been centered around the idea of common grace, and that's fine. But I think a better focus would be just the nature of the light of nature. Common grace as a terminology and things goes back to the Reformation and whatever. It's especially important in Neo-Calvinism. I think there's a lot more resources and a lot more of common ground that could be had if we were discussing about the light of nature and Christian prudence. I mean, you have a whole intellectual tradition on the virtues that goes back on these things. So I think the sufficiency statement is not sufficient in itself. Now, I want to comment on a couple of things related to the article related to this on sufficiency of Scripture. So Heath makes a couple of comments that are interesting. He says, we do not believe that he has told us everything, that being God, but we believe he has given us principles to understand every counseling problem and its solution. That seems, I think, reasonable. He's given us principles to be able to engage every sort of situation and have a problem and a solution. And generically speaking, yeah, I think that's probably accurate. But then he says other things like, we have no desire to reject any facts in God's world, but rather believe in, use, and celebrate extra biblical information grounded in a biblical view of common grace. Okay. As important as such information is, we do not believe it is ever appropriate to use that outside information. That just seems weird. So you just told me we don't want to reject it, but it's never appropriate to use it. So that is a de facto rejection, is it not? However true it might be, as a replacement for or adjunct to the essential insight into the problems people have to, or the interventions necessary for change that are prescribed in Scripture. Right. So this is like he's shifting the goalposts a good bit. So it's basically, it goes from it's never appropriate to use it, but it's never appropriate to use it as a replacement or an adjunct. Okay, replacement, that makes sense. Adjunct, I'm not quite sure what that means. I mean, there's obvious examples here, like do the accreditations of the biblical counseling group, movement, or whatever, does that undermine the sufficiency of Scripture, the fact that they're giving these extra biblical tools and certifications? Do the YouTube videos or the blog posts that Heath are putting, is that undermining the sufficiency of Scripture since it's outside of Scripture itself? Do the seminaries that they support, does when I think of extra biblical information from psychology, from neuroscience, from medicine, all those things should be appropriate given the Second London Confession of Faith and given just Christian tradition on this. Those insights are fine to use and incorporate, as so long as they do not contradict Scripture and that they are demonstrably, objectively true. That seems straightforward. So the second point to cover is, what does integration mean? So there's some interesting claims in this essay that I just think are incredibly interesting and maybe confusing. I'm not sure. So he says, for decades, integration has not referred to the process of engaging with other views, but to the practice following such engagement when secular insights, interventions are added to Scripture and counseling practice. So it seems like he's saying integration doesn't mean that you just engage stuff that's outside the Bible. It means that you add to Scripture in counseling practice. I'm not quite clear on what that means. So he goes on and he says a couple of other things. Integration is not the biblical evaluation of a secular system, but the syncretization of a secular system with biblical truth. So that's a big charge. But also notice he's talking about systems. So he's basically seems to think that if you use an insight from neuroscience or something, you find out something about the brain and how it works, and you say, well, that's interesting that you're dealing with this problem because brain science or whatever tells us this, this, and this. Now let's look at the Bible and how that sort of fits together. Seems like that's taking an entire system somehow and plopping it in place of biblical truth. And that just seems patently false on its face. I'm not sure what else to do with that. He says, between a classic approach to the integration of secular psychology with biblical truth on the one side, and on the other side, a uniquely biblical approach to counseling, which views Scripture as sufficient for counseling care. Right? So he's making this clear contrast. It's an either or. There's no middle ground. There's no in between on this stuff. So it seems like all quite rather, I don't know, overblown or too much. So he says this as well. We do not believe that any information outside Scripture, no qualifications, can be used to replace the biblical insights of what's wrong with people. So what's key here again is he's saying like replace. I don't know of anyone, integration or not. And again, like I said, I'm not a counselor. I don't know all the integrationists. I haven't read all their stuff, whatever. But I can speak, I think, confidently about the fact that using any information to replace, I don't know of anybody who's trying to replace a biblical insight. Say, oh, I found this thing in secular psychology. I'm going to replace something that's true in Scripture with this and say, I'm rejecting this and I'm putting this in place. I don't know anyone who's doing that, who's saying, oh, the problem of sin. Yeah, let's replace that with the problem of something else that secular psychology tells us. So he says we affirm the existence of extra biblical information in general, but specifically reject the use of secular counseling interventions in actual counseling practice. So it seems like there's just a lot of like weaving and going back and forth and saying things that are just patently false and saying some things that are true and just obviously true, trivially true. And it's kind of weird. So he says other things here. This claim is astounding. So this was interesting. This claim is astounding precisely because there's no leader, professor, author, or practitioner in the entire biblical counseling movement of whom I'm aware that, quote, strongly insist that the incorporation of extra biblical material in counseling is either unnecessary or unfaithful, end quote. Well, I'm pretty sure he just did say that you can't use anything. you let's see, it's never appropriate to use that outside information. Now he does make this like to replace, and he says this things in other places, and it's like, okay, I'm not sure you understand what you're saying or you're communicating. So it's interesting because he says every biblical counseling leader, professor, author, and serious practitioner affirms the existence of extra biblical information as essential to life and counseling ministry. What? These are like completely competing claims in the same essay. I have no idea what's going on. So someone please enlighten me. He says, we believe it's syncretistic to mix secular worldviews with the content of biblical counseling, yeah, as it would be to mix those same fallen worldviews with biblical preaching. Like it's totally confusing. And so hopefully you get the sense here that I'm not quite sure what integration means or what it is or what the evaluation of it's supposed to be. If it's just this trivially true thing of if you reject the Bible and get rid of portions of it and replace it with not unbiblical, obviously false things, then yeah, who would be an integrationist? No Christian would be. But if it like it seems like he's creating a straw man and just pelting things at it and then saying, oh, it's actually you who's the one who's creating a straw man because look at what I said here. But that patently contradicts what he says elsewhere and repeatedly and emphatically. So I think what's interesting here is the nature of moral formation and sanctification. So it seems to me that reading these essays, as I've been reading them, or these blog posts, whatever they are, it seems that those like Heath seem to think that moral improvement is only possible through supernatural means. It's only possible by divine grace and in a particular way. It's important to distinguish nature and supernature in very, very clear ways. And so it would be like, I mean, just scripture versus the book of nature. And they think you can only morally improve through the Bible, but that's patently false. You can see that from your neighbor who might be a good parent or a good dad or might be a good brother, and they might do virtuous acts. And so now living in a God honoring way requires supernatural means, of course, but many of these counseling issues seem to be requiring the fixing of habits, the fixing of patterns of thought. And secular counseling can certainly be helpful here. That might not be the whole story. That is never the whole story, of course, but it's definitely part of a holistic improvement plan of growing in virtue. I think that's where certain books and thoughts can be very valuable, particularly Aristotelian thought, sort of Aristotelian virtue tradition. So you've got like Alistair McIntyre's After Virtue is helpful. Jennifer Hertz putting on virtue would be a very, very helpful resource for a lot of these discussions. Even Matthew Lepine's Logic of the Body, and then recently Ezra Sullivan's Habits and Holiness. I mean, a lot of these books and these ideas and these thoughts and these concepts would be really valuable to include in this discussion. I think that would enhance it. It seems that what I've seen that Heath doesn't read or watch or do anything that anybody else does, apparently, even though he's doing like I don't know, whatever. I think the concept of moral formation, sanctification, and what that requires, supernatural or natural means, would be a very, very valuable discussion. So what do I say in conclusion? Well, I guess there's a couple of things. One of those is I think it's really important to do the proper theological work before trying to deploy a theological concept. And so I think more engagement with not only the sufficiency of Scripture in the historical tradition, but and within the Bible itself, but also just the sort of frameworks that are required for moral formation and for sanctification, I think would be of a great benefit to this sort of discussion and these ongoing discussions. It seems like sufficiency of Scripture gets brought up in pretty much every sort of conversation that I see in evangelicalism as sort of this trump card for I win if you're a fundamentalist. And if you're not with me on these sort of like really niche and narrow ideas, then you're denying the sufficiency of Scripture and you're giving up the Bible, blah, 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 blah. I think that's just silly and foolish and is evidence of not doing the proper care, dealing with topics with care. I will also mention in conclusion a comment again by Heath himself. He says, to be clear, I'm not opposing the use of strong arguments and advancing a position. Good. That's great. I agree. He said, I've made a few of those myself. I'm opposing any argument that's recklessly and irresponsibly incorrect. Again, I mean, I'd have to agree with that. The problem, though, is Number one, the inflammatory rhetoric that's used here that's unnecessarily being used. I mean, and then I guess number two is the fact that I don't think it's reckless or irresponsible to point out some of these contradictions and these confusions in his work and those who are advocating these sort of things. When you name names and offer serious critique, this is him again. You have a serious responsibility to avoid misrepresentation and mischaracterization. I agree with that. It's just not clear to me where exactly it is that people are misrepresenting him or those like him on this particular topic. I mean, I've gone through quite a few of his sections and quotes, and it seems that what he says contradicts itself. So in one way, when you do that, you can recourse and say, no, look what I said here, and say, look, I'm exonerated. But that doesn't, I mean, because then you've said something that contradicts it somewhere else, and that seems to be what you've emphasized over and over and over and over again, to the exclusion of this concession that you've made here. And so then to call somebody reckless or irresponsible is just silliness. And this does seem to be it's a pastoral question. It's a counseling question, but it's also an academic question in the right sort of context. And so making strong arguments is not reckless or irresponsible. I mean, people are citing people, they're trying to argue and engage this. And so even if they're wrong, it's not reckless or irresponsible. That's the wrong language to use. Reckless and irresponsible would be saying that Heath or others or whoever, pick your poison or your favorite bad guy or villain, whoever it is, and not say that Heath's poison. You get the point. It's not, what's reckless would be to not quote somebody, not cite somebody, and just put words in their mouth and say exactly like they think that the Bible's not real or something like that. That is reckless. That is irresponsible. But to cite people, maybe they read them incorrectly, maybe they misunderstand them, maybe they don't get those citations right. That's not reckless or irresponsible. That's just wrong. And then you engage that and push back on that. And that's that. So let me know what you guys think. Do you think this is helpful? Do you agree with Heath? Do you not agree with him? What exactly do you think is right or wrong in these confusions that he's laid out? What do you think about the scriptural sufficiency, integration, moral formation, sanctification? Let me know. And I look forward to thinking with you all soon on Kiffin's Keep. Talk to you guys soon.